Democrats, alarmed by President Joe Biden's debate performance against Republican rival Donald Trump, are openly questioning whether he should be replaced as their candidate in the 2024 election.
The panic has continued.
The University of Virginia's Center for Politics director, Larry Sabato, said the process to replace a presidential nominee is clear, but it wouldn't be easy.
There is only one way for a nominee to be removed, and that is for the nominee to decide not to run before the convention, to open it up, to let the, in this case, Democratic National Committee set the rules for the convention, which would be an open convention with declared candidacies in advance, probably support from a certain number of state delegations. So the convention, in a sense, will serve as a primary electorate that has already voted. In order for Biden to step down, you would have to have a union of Barack Obama, Hillary Clinton, Bill Clinton, Nancy Pelosi, and they would have to all agree that he has to go in the interest of the country and in the interest of defeating Donald Trump. They would have to go to the White House and try to convince him, and he will be tough to convince. And they'll also have to try to convince Joe Biden, and that may be even tougher.
Sabato has a long list of possible replacements, but said there is no obvious top choice.
Kamala Harris has to be on the list because she's the incumbent vice president. I don't think she would be a particularly strong nominee. Governor Gavin Newsom, not just because he's governor of California, but because he has access to tons of money, which the new nominee would have to raise very, very quickly. There aren't many people who could do it. Governor Gretchen Whitmer would absolutely be in this mix, Michigan being one of the key swing states. Governor Pritzker of Illinois, who could self-fund. Governor Andy Beshear in Kentucky. Kentucky's deeply red, but Beshear's managed to be elected twice, which isn't easy for a Democrat in Kentucky. Governor Shapiro of Pennsylvania, who's become very popular very quickly, an articulate guy who comes across well and fits Pennsylvania, a key swing state, probably better than Joe Biden does, and certainly better than Donald Trump does.
So far, Biden says he isn't going anywhere. His campaign held an all-hands-on-deck meeting a day after the debate to reassure staffers that the 81-year-old was not dropping out of the race, according to two people familiar with the meeting.
If this were anybody else but Donald Trump as the Republican nominee, this race would be over. It is only because Donald Trump is so controversial and so widely feared for what he may do that Biden is still in the race. He still could win. Of course, you can also say that about Trump. If there were a new, vigorous, younger Democratic nominee, I think people would take that opportunity in a minute to keep Trump out.
Iran's presidential election has gone to a runoff, where a moderate lawmaker will stand against a protege of the supreme leader. It came down to a tight race between a low-profile lawmaker, Masoud Pezeshkian, the sole moderate in a field of 4 candidates, and former Revolutionary Guards member Saeed Jalili. The Islamic Republic's Interior Ministry said on Saturday that no candidate had secured enough votes, and a second round will be held on July 5th. Turnout in Friday's election hit a historic low of about 40%, based on an Interior Ministry count. Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei had called on voters to turn out, hoping to boost the legitimacy of the clerical establishment. But there's widespread discontent over economic hardship and restrictions on political and social freedom. Many Iranians have mocked the vote on X with the hashtag #ElectionsCircus. Pezeshkian, though faithful to Iran's theocratic rule, has publicly criticised authorities over the death of Mahsa Amini, an Iranian Kurdish woman whose death in custody sparked mass unrest in Iran in 2022. He also favours détente with the West, while Jalili is staunchly anti-Western. Neither candidate is expected to usher in significant shifts for Iran, because Khamenei calls the shots on major issues, like Iran's nuclear program and support for militant groups Hamas and Hezbollah. But the next president would run the government and affect the tone of domestic and foreign policy, and could even influence the succession to Khamenei.
Bolivian leftist president Luis Arce says support on the streets has strengthened his government after a failed military coup just days ago. The quiet economist was thrust into the global spotlight on Wednesday when rogue military units seized the central square of La Paz and rammed a door of the presidential palace with an armoured vehicle. The general who led the coup, Juan José Zuniga, was ordered to serve 6 months preventative detention for his role, a top prosecutor said on Friday. Arce had warned that the landlocked country of some 12 million people was facing a coup and called for supporters to mobilise. Face-to-face, he ordered Zuniga to stand down, and hours later, as support for the coup disintegrated, the soldiers pulled back. Arce spoke exclusively to Reuters in one of his first interviews since then.
The last thing we were thinking about was not how we will be, but rather the most important way to defend democracy, and happily with the support of the people in the streets, and with the international support that we have received. That has strengthened us to be here again, to continue the work that as president is my responsibility to undertake. So for us, absolutely nothing has changed.
Arce acknowledged financial strains on the gas-producing Bolivian economy, which has led to a shortage of dollars, petrol at the pumps, and growing voter dissatisfaction, but blamed, quote, external and internal interests for adding to the country's economic pressures.
There is temporary illiquidity of American dollars. That is why we have taken several measures that will precisely resolve the issue. Of course, we have said it. We have been taking several measures to solve all the problems that are being placed in our path.
Zuniga has been handed a terrorism charge, which carries 15 to 20 years in prison, as well as a charge for an armed uprising.
Francis Ochieng is struggling to come to terms with the damage inflicted on his business in Nairobi. Days of anti-government protests in Kenya were accompanied by some vandalism and looting. Ochieng says he's lost almost $10,000 after his shop was set ablaze.
It is hard. I do not know where to start, and I have a family. I have a wife with a small child and school-going children. So from that day, I have not eaten. You see how I am right now. I do not know where to start.
Someone else likely counting the cost of the unrest, Kenya's President William Ruto.
I will not sign the 2024 finance bill.
His withdrawal of support for a finance bill has complicated efforts to tackle Kenya's heavy debt burden. Public borrowing is 68% of GDP, higher than the 55% recommended by the World Bank and the IMF. The IMF has urged Kenya to meet revenue targets to access more funding. The unpopular finance bill would have aimed to raise $2.7 billion through taxes on items including bread, cooking oil, and diapers. But now, Kenya is shifting from raising revenues to cutting spending. Ruto has said he will work on austerity measures, starting with cuts to the budget of the presidency. But political analyst James Shikwati said the protests have exposed deeper issues in Kenya.
So there's a finance bill, but there's also how the government is enacting its measures to widen the tax base. And those measures are actually stifling or killing enterprises. And it's enterprises that employ young people.
Shikwati said Ruto's election campaign message of 2 years ago, when he portrayed himself as a champion of low-income hustlers, had come back to bite him, and that young people are really, really mad at him. Some activists say they don't trust the government won't still try to implement tax rises, and many have vowed to keep calling for Ruto to step down.
The Eastern Caribbean was bracing for the unusually early Category 4 Hurricane Beryl as it raced toward them Sunday. Shops in St. Vincent were boarded up, while residents packed petrol stations to fill up their cars. While 100 miles to the east in Barbados, shoppers were rushing to stock up at this supermarket in Bridgetown. Beryl has already made history as the earliest Category 4 hurricane on record, and it's expected to bring life-threatening winds and flash floods to the island on Monday. Justina is a manager at a hardware store in Bridgetown.
We opened about half an hour earlier this morning to accommodate the rush. And they have been buying generators, 5-pound buckets, everything you can think about they're getting. We're almost out of, you can see searchlights, extension cords, ladders, tape, whatever they can get their hands on, they're getting.
The U.S. National Hurricane Center says the hurricane was located about 250 miles southeast of Barbados on Sunday afternoon, with winds of 130 miles per hour. It is rare for a major hurricane to appear this early in the Atlantic hurricane season, which runs from the start of June to the end of November. A Category 4 storm is the second strongest level on a 5-step scale. Michael Brennan, the director of National Hurricane Center, says a storm of that strength can be destructive.
When you get to Category 4 strength, you can see things like total roof damage, roofs lifted off of homes, exterior wall collapse, trees uprooted, significant damage and complete destruction of power lines and other infrastructures.
In May, the U.S. National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration predicted above normal Atlantic hurricane activity for 2024 due to warm ocean temperatures. Beryl comes a little over a week earlier than previous record holder Hurricane Dennis, which got to Category 4 on July 8, 2005. Hurricane warnings have been issued in Barbados, St. Lucia, St. Vincent and Grenadine Islands, Grenada and Tobago, with tropical storm watches everywhere in the Caribbean, while dangerous swells are expected to hit Puerto Rico and Hispaniola.
The U.S. Supreme Court raised the legal bar on Friday for prosecutors pursuing obstruction charges against January 6th rioters. In a 6-3 decision, the court threw out a lower court's ruling that had allowed a charge of corruptly obstructing an official proceeding against a former police officer, the congressional certification of President Joe Biden's victory over Trump that the rioters sought to prevent. The justices directed the lower court to reconsider the matter. They took a narrow view of the statute, ruling that obstruction charges must include proof that defendants tried to tamper with or destroy documents. The ruling is a potential boost for Trump, who was hit with the obstruction charge as part of a 4-count criminal indictment in a case brought last year by special counsel Jack Smith. One former federal prosecutor told Reuters the high bar wouldn't stop Smith from pursuing obstruction charges against Trump. The campaign of Democratic President Joe Biden said in a statement that the court's ruling, quote, does not change the fundamental truth that Donald Trump will always put himself over our democracy. While U.S. Attorney General Merrick Garland said on Friday he was disappointed by the decision, but indicated it would not affect the cases of the vast majority of the more than 1,400 defendants charged for their actions on January 6th.
Boeing is set to face criminal charges over fraud following the 2 fatal crashes of its 737 MAX jets some years ago. Reuters sources said Sunday that the US Department of Justice had decided on the course of action. There was no comment on the report from officials or the company. The deadly crashes took place in 2018 and 2019, killing 346 people. They were later traced to a design flaw in the jets, which has since been fixed. Boeing agreed a deferred prosecution deal, which shielded it from criminal charges. That was in return for compensating victims' families and taking steps to improve compliance. But in January this year, a mid-air blowout on another MAX jet revived concern over how well the planes are made. Prosecutors subsequently concluded that Boeing had not honoured the terms of the deferred prosecution deal, something the company disputes. Now Boeing will reportedly have until the end of the week to plead guilty or face a trial. It is expected to see a new financial penalty and will have to submit to independent monitoring. Pleading guilty may not be an attractive move for the firm, which is also a big maker of military aircraft and other defence gear. Companies with felony convictions can face restrictions on government contracts, though it's possible a plea deal could include terms that avoid such an outcome.
Financial markets were oddly relieved by the results of the first round of parliamentary elections in France on more than 2%, more than all other European bourses, on investors' apparent belief that the far-right party of Marine Le Pen will not control a majority of seats after the second round on July 7. Investors may be a little optimistic, but they are right if they think that the economic and financial risk of a far-right government is higher than that of political chaos if no party can command a majority. Le Pen's parti, Rassemblement National, came ahead with 33% of the vote, with a coalition of left-wing parties receiving 28% and the movement supporting President Emmanuel Macron 21%. The French are now called by leaders of the left and by Macron, the big loser of the elections, to vote against the far-right candidates on Sunday. As things stand now, Rassemblement National will struggle to obtain a majority of seats. In that case, it will be up to Macron to appoint a prime minister at the helm of a minority government, after possibly trying to rally a few centrist MPs from left and right. That would be a politically weakened government, unable to make decisions on most important matters. As a prelude, Macron's Prime Minister, Gabriel Attal, Sunday night already cancelled, he said postponed, a controversial reform of unemployment benefits that was due to come into force on Monday. But the far right still has a decent chance to control the next parliament. And then it would have to implement at least part of its platform. It includes about 100 billion euros of unfunded tax cuts and spending, which would put it on a collision course with the EU. Without even mentioning the possibility of massive street protests, it would trigger serious concerns about France's debt load. That's when foreign investors should really start to worry, and that's why they want to keep thinking that this will not happen.